Greetings, everyone. My name is Sarah Barnes, and on behalf of Campbell & Company, I'd like to welcome you to Campaign Effects on Annual Giving. Before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to quickly review some logistics for those of you who may be new to our webinars. And you can change the slide there. To ensure you have the best webinar experience, please follow these tips. First, close any programs other than GoTo, of course, that are running on your computer. You can call in using a telephone instead of using your computer speakers. Move away your cell phone from your computer, and if you experience any visual issues, you can send a chat to Campbell & Company or contact GoTo at 1-800-263-6317. Today's webinar will last 60 minutes, and you will earn 1 continuing education credit, and that is good for participation with CFRE International. About an hour after the webinar, you will receive an email from GoToWebinars that includes a web address to download your certificate and a link to the presentation. So with that, I'd like to tell you about Kate Roosevelt and Dan Pronovost, and they are live at our Seattle office. I'm here in Chicago. So Kate and Dan, we're excited to have you featured on today's webinar. So Kate Roosevelt is Executive Vice President at Campbell & Company, where she serves on the executive committee and oversees the firm's West Coast operations, including the Collins Group division. In her client work, Kate's intelligence and calm in the storm guidance has helped nonprofit organizations raise more than $500 million. Kate regularly presents on fundraising topics at local and national conferences and is an active member of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, Advancement Northwest. As a volunteer, Kate is a trustee of Colby College, her alma mater. She has served in leadership positions on the boards of several Seattle area conservation and affordable housing groups. So she is quite busy, obviously. And Dan Pronovost has worked as a nonprofit fundraising professional in the Seattle area for over a decade with extensive experience in capital campaigns, major and annual giving, volunteer management, and community outreach. Prior to joining Campbell & Company in 2015, Dan worked as a major gifts officer with Seattle Repertory Theater, an annual fund manager at Big Brothers Big Sisters of Puget Sound. I think, did I pronounce that right, guys? Did I get that right?
Puget.
All right, Puget, all right, and as Director of Development for University Child Development School in Seattle. Dan has lent his fundraising experience to Bellevue Youth Symphony Orchestra, and he has been a mentor to young people through Community for Youth, a nonprofit organization that provides one-to-one mentoring opportunities to high school students. Dan holds a master's degree from the University of Washington's Evans School of Public Affairs with a focus on nonprofit management. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you guys.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. We're really pleased that you're with us today. We appreciate your time and your interest in this topic. And before we dive in, I would just like to take a minute to share with you how we're going to spend our time together today. First of all, we want to share with you how we arrived at this topic and we're motivated and compelled to explore the topic of how campaigns affect annual giving. We'll share our top line findings with you. Dan's going to walk through several case studies to bring the findings to life. We will then share our thoughts on what we think this all means in terms of best practices, share some final thoughts, and then we'd like to make sure that we have maybe 10 to 15 minutes at the end of our hour together today to hear and address your questions. So thank you again. Before we jump in, we'd love to hear a little bit about you. And we have 2 polls that we'd like to take, real-time polls here. And the question that we're asking you to answer, and you'll see on your GoTo webinar toolbar, what effect, if any, do you think campaigns have on annual giving? So go ahead and answer the poll and share your thoughts with us.
Okay, they're coming in. So we're gonna wait a little bit here. We're at about 60% of you have voted thus far. Answers are still coming in. This is like the political election of the year right here. All right, we're up to 72. We're gonna aim for a 90%. If we can.
Just a few more of you, please weigh in and answer the question.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and close. So it looks like 40% answered yes, campaigns adversely affect. 33% said no, campaigns do not adversely affect annual giving, and then 28% said don't know or do not have an opinion. So it looks like there's kind of an equal spread between yes and no.
Okay, so interesting, and I think that sets a great foundation for our conversation today, and I think supports one of the reasons why we wanted to do this research, which is that most people have a sense that campaigns adversely affect annual giving. So on to our next poll.
Okay.
We would love to know from you where you are in the campaign cycle, and you'll see a number of options for you to tell us where you are in terms of planning a campaign, dreaming about a campaign. Maybe you're in active fundraising mode, you're wrapping up, or you're done and you're looking back and reflecting on your campaign experience.
Okay, got about 75% of you have voted. All right, getting close to that 90% threshold. Okay, we'll go ahead and close that, and we'll share the results.
Interesting.
Can you see the results?
Yes, I can. I'm going to pop this out actually so I can take a look at it. And interestingly, it looks like we have more than a third of you who are actually in campaign mode, another 42% who are planning a campaign, and 10% who are at the dreaming stage. So for those of you who are dreaming and planning, we hope this is especially useful for you. For those of you who are actively fundraising, there's still time to plan for how your campaign can actually support and grow your annual fund. And for those who are wrapping up and looking back, we're glad you're with us, because no doubt you're probably already thinking about your next campaign. So thank you. That was really, really helpful. So we'd love to jump in and share with you how we arrived at this topic. You know, some years ago, I've been with the firm now for 17 years, and I think in all of my time here, I've heard fairly consistently the question, the concern from our clients as they're beginning to plan for a campaign: how can we make sure that our campaign doesn't damage or cannibalize, is the favorite word, our annual fund? So we wanted to explore this question and try to match it with our anecdotal experience, which tells us that, in fact, in the vast majority of cases, anecdotally, we believe that annual funds don't suffer during campaigns, and in fact, they're at worst status quo, and at best, they actually help to grow the annual fund and the overall visibility of the organization. So we wanted to compare perception with reality.
So how we went about doing this. So the first step we wanted to do is survey folks that we have worked with, former clients who had finished a campaign in the last 5 years. And so we went through our database. There aren't a ton of organizations, so we went national and we pulled out everyone we could find. There were 56 former Collins Group or Campbell & Company clients that we reached out to who had completed their campaign in the last 5 years. A couple of important notes in just how we set up the survey. We didn't want people to get bogged down in all of the statistics, every last individual number. So we gave people ranges. Did it go up by 3 to 5%? Did it go down by 1 to 3%? And we asked them to make their best guesses based on what their knowledge, having been with the organization during the campaign and since it wrapped up. So over 75% of the people who completed the survey were development directors. There were other annual gift managers and CEOs as well that filled it out. The response rate we got to the 56 surveys that we sent out, there were 11 folks who filled it out in detail, which was too small of a number to make a statistical analysis. So what we decided to do instead, we looked very carefully at those numbers. We wanted to make sure that we were getting a wide spread of organizations by sector, by budget size. We asked questions like, how engaged was your board? What was your campaign goal? We really wanted to get a sense of who was filling this out so that when we started to look at the numbers, it didn't feel like only large organizations were having success or only small organizations were hamstrung by this process. So when we looked at all those numbers, what we decided was there was really only one obvious trend, and that trend that sort of bled through all the results was that the larger you were, the less likely you were to have success in your annual fund after the campaign was over. In other words, we were seeing really small organizations having tremendous success, and then the larger they got, the kind of less success they would report to us. So we decided to do some follow-up around size of organization. So we conducted 6 interviews, 2 with small organizations, 2 with medium-sized, and 2 with large-sized organizations. And we just wanted to probe a little bit deeper on what exactly they felt caused their success or failure in particular areas. So you can see here, these are the sectors that were represented of the 11 folks that filled it out. We had arts and culture, environment. It pretty much ran the gamut. Again, small numbers. We didn't try to necessarily statistically analyze this. We were just looking at all the data in the sense of trends. Campaign goals, there was a pretty wide spread. We had one campaign as low as 400,000. Another campaign was around 100 million. So you can see here on the right, the graph is the distribution of the various campaign goals. And then also we were curious about size, and we were looking at this from 2 different perspectives. One was development staff prior to the campaign. We asked if folks staffed up before and during the campaign, and almost everyone did that. So we were interested in what their campaign size was before they got started. As you can see, 5 of the 11 were 2 or less. So the majority were on the smaller side. There were 3 in the middle, and then 3 had 6 or more, and 1 as high as 17. And then the current annual budget for these organizations, again, 2 less than $1 million. There were 6 that were in that 1 to 10 range, and 3 ended up at over 50 million.
Thanks, Dan. So we'd like to jump into our top line findings and share with you what we have learned. So first of all, the headline really for this entire report is that we found that both during and after the campaign, most organizations who participated in this project experienced no change or an increase in 3 areas: their total annual contributed revenue, the size of their donor base, and their average gift size. And in addition, most organizations that participated in this project felt that the campaign had an extremely positive or positive effect on their annual fund. So a little bit more detail here for you. We know that 5 of the 11 organizations noted that they experienced an increase in their total contributed revenue. 5 said no change. So there was only 1 respondent that experienced a decrease or a loss in their annual contributed revenue during their campaign. More on that in a minute, because it's kind of surprising which organization that was in terms of size and sector. 9 organizations reported a moderate or significant increase in their donor base, and 9 organizations reported a moderate or significant increase in their average gift size. So overall, very positive results for these organizations during their campaigns. Interestingly, we also learned that after the campaign, 6 of the respondents experienced an increase in their total revenue, and of those, 4 had a 10% or more increase in their annual giving after their campaign. Finally, on the donor base statistic, 9 organizations reported a moderate increase in their donor base, and no one reported a decrease in the size of their donor base. Average gift size, 7 reported a moderate or significant increase in average gift size. And then this last bullet point around self-assessed effect, 10 organizations, so 10 of the 11 organizations that responded to our survey stated that the campaign had a positive or extremely positive overall impact on their annual fundraising. So some quotes for you. Our capital campaign allowed us to initiate annual giving by creating a donor base. So some folks use their campaign to actually launch a more significant fundraising program. Another person noted, since folks have paid off their pledges, their annual support has generally increased. Our annual campaign in 2015, the year that most of the campaign pledges were paid off, was an increase of 40% over the prior year. So pretty interesting findings, and we were happy to hear that this, in fact, that our perception that campaigns help and at worst do no harm to the organizations that are undertaking those campaigns was in fact supported by these responses. So a little bit more, when Dan dug into his interviews with the 6 organizations, a few things came up for us that we learned, and really kind of falls into 4 categories. First of all, several organizations did express to us that prior to starting the campaign, they were nervous about what effect the campaign would have on their annual giving and had an overall sense or perception that the campaign would harm their annual fund. Secondly, they noted that in spite of that feeling on the front end of the campaign, as the campaign unfolded, their concerns actually dissipated and went away as they began to engage with donors and talk with them. And you'll hear more about that during the best practices section of this presentation. Third, really to a person, the respondents said that they found that the campaign provided them with an opportunity and also a need to strengthen their systems and their infrastructure to support a healthier, more sustainable level of fundraising. And finally, they also noted that the campaign motivated or inspired them to sort of think outside of the box about how they raise money, that they were more open to risk-taking and experimentation and working through different strategies to determine what was going to work best for their donor base. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dan, and he's going to walk us through some of his case studies.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kate. So we did, not only did organizations take the time to fill out a lot of these data-heavy questions, but 6 of the 11 took the time to meet with us by phone and answer a whole slew of questions, follow-up questions that we had. So hopefully some of those organizations are listening right now. We want to thank them for all their contributions to this project. So like I said earlier, we were looking basically by size to see what the results were and why organizations were reporting what they were reporting. And so we looked at 6 organizations, 2 in each size, and for the case studies, we picked one of each of those. The small organization was an environmental organization, the medium-sized one was a human services organization, and the large one was a higher education organization. So for the first case study, the small organization, you can see here it's environmental. It had less than $1 million annual budget. There was a 0.5 full-time equivalent development staff. After talking with the development staff representative, I think that fluctuated somewhere between 0.5 and 1, depending on the season and what else was going on with events and other things. So she wanted me to be very clear. It wasn't fully half-time, but regardless, they had a pretty low staff. The campaign goal, $8 million, fairly ambitious for an organization that small, and the campaign length, 4 to 5 years. And so what we found, this is kind of what the numbers showed. During the campaign, they experienced the 1 to 3% increase in annual giving. They had a significant increase in their donor base and a moderate increase in the average gift size. After the campaign, and this is really where it gets striking, is 10% increase in annual giving with a moderate increase in donor size and average gift size. We also asked a little bit about the channels in which they were asking for money, and they saw a significant increase in the direct mail or online giving, major and planned giving. So a few notes real quick on these guys. One of the things that they had been contemplating a study for, or excuse me, a campaign for years. And they told me that it was really a lack of experience, or what they perceived as a lack of experience by their staff, that kept them from taking the plunge. But her quote after this was, looking back on it, the campaign in general was the best fundraising training that you can possibly have for your organization. So it really did serve as a way to grow and learn quite a bit about your board and your volunteers and your development staff, about how to run campaigns and development practices. Another thing that happened before the campaign was sort of a changing of the mindset. And really, goes back to a culture of philanthropy. She described to me an organization that had very caring and loving board members who saw fundraising as a necessary evil. And I'm sure a lot of people can relate to this. The mission of the organization is not to raise money. The mission is to help people and to have programs and services that benefit people. So oftentimes development gets pushed off into the corner. And this was an opportunity to have a conversation about, how do we put development front and center for our organization? How do we make it critical to delivering the services that we want to provide for the community? And then during the campaign, it just provided a lot of opportunities for them to talk to donors. Donors had been very generous with them in the past, but oftentimes it was at arm's length. And this was an opportunity for them to build from their most generous donors, as well as brand new donors, a conversation, a really ongoing conversation around what the organization did, what the mission, and why this was a critical time for the organization. And just, I wrote in my notes as I was talking to her, kind of what happened to the organization after the campaign. And one of the things I jotted down was, a little confidence goes a long way. And the reason why is that everything that they learned in the campaign stuck with them after the campaign. So, and her direct quote was, "We're much more confident, willing to ask, and we've created a culture of gratitude in the organization." So it really had some lasting effects in that regard.
Cool.
The medium-sized human services organization, you can see here, medium being classified by budget, which is 1 to just under 5 million. 3 full-time development staff prior to the campaign. The campaign goal, 3.5 million, and the campaign length, 4 to 5 years. And so you can see here, again, during the campaign, 4 to 6% increase in annual giving, and they saw a significant increase in the gift size, significant increase in events and major giving. That's not uncommon. The campaigns focus a lot on events and major giving, so that is what you would expect to see. It's the after the campaign, the 10+ increase in annual giving, the significant increase in annual average gift size, and then also corporate sponsorships and major giving continued to give significantly after the campaign. And what this organization, I think, they were already doing a lot of major gift kind of portfolio management type of things, but they weren't doing them as structured as they could have been. I think this is an example of moving in an organization from good to great. They really were doing a lot of good things that before the campaign, but the way that they institutionalized in their cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship practices carried through the campaign and beyond. So that gave them a really positive foothold and foundation to build their program. They started right off the bat telling the story of the organization. I think one of the things that they credited for their success was that they got a lot of buzz from their architectural awards and public awareness and other press that is essentially free media. It's just out there that they figured out how to capitalize on and share that with their donors and create that real feeling of excitement as the campaign was going on. They had an example of what I would describe as a best case scenario. Through this process, they were cultivating a capital campaign gift from a donor who had not given to the organization. And by the time they landed that gift, it was a gift of $500,000 to the campaign, which is exceptional. That's right at the top of the pyramid. But what the donor also did was they managed to transfer that donor to a $75,000 annual donor after the campaign. So this is the best case scenario where you're taking someone who finds your mission compelling, who finds the case for support of this capital endeavor, and then carries that giving on to the organization. And when you multiply $75,000 over a 3 or 5 year period, you're looking at a gift that's almost as significant over 5 years to the organization as the one-time gift would be of the capital. Another thing they did that was really interesting that was pointed out to me, they really targeted new donors to the organization that came through the campaign. So they did a lot of segmentation right off the bat on how do we figure out how to include these folks in all of our communications, how do we thank them, how do we steward them, invite them to events. They weren't just lumped in as general donors, they were given a high profile within the development department, and no matter what the gift size was, they were considered critical if they were new to the organization. And the result of that was that they got a retention rate that was equal to their longtime donors. So it shows that when that is a priority, you can have tremendous results. One of the things that they told me was they grew at about an average of 6% prior to the campaign. That was their growth rate year over year. The first year after the campaign ended, their growth rate was 15%, and they were expecting an even bigger year the following year. That's how many gifts were coming in that they didn't expect. And the final organization was a large higher education organization. And when we say large, we mean large. $100+ million was their annual budget, 17 full-time staff just on the development side, $100 million campaign goal, and the campaign length was 7 years. So by all accounts and all measurements, these guys had very ambitious goals for their campaign. So one of the things we noticed right off the bat, through the course of that 7 years, they had some up years and some down years, but when you average it out, they basically had no change in their annual giving. They had a moderate increase in their donor base and average gift size, and a significant increase in major and planned giving. The big thing that we noticed, and this is one of the reasons why we really decided to look at size of organization, they did not experience some of the bump and the growth rate that a lot of the other organizations did. In fact, they reported a 10+% decrease in their annual giving after the campaign, along with a moderate decrease in the average gift size, and funding from corporations and foundations, direct and online giving, and major giving all were down moderately after the campaign. So a couple of things that this organization makes them unique. One was at the start of the campaign, they had a fully flushed out major giving program. They had major gift officers with clearly defined portfolios. They had a CEO that had been there for 20+ years, that had great relationships with their longtime major donors. And so they were in perfect position to have success in all phases of their campaign. One of the things that came along, I would call it good old-fashioned bad luck. They started their campaign just prior to the Great Recession, and so part of the reason it went for 7 years is it was extended through the Great Recession, which, as we all know, took a toll on fundraising. As a result, they had to change some of their campaign goals, and as a result, their communication was a little stilted with some of their donors. And even the donors that they did steward and communicate with, they were given more general messages, general thank you messages, as opposed to giving them specific information about the campaign and what their gift was going to build. They did have a huge influx of new donors. So the person at this organization told me that throughout the course of those 7 years, approximately 50% of the donors to the institution were new donors that came through that capital campaign. I mean, think about that for a second. Half the donors that came through in a 7-year period were brand new and brought to them through that campaign. One of the things that she reported, however, was there was a clear lack of stewardship of those donors. They were not signaled out. They were not communicated with or treated special in any regard necessarily. Her quote specifically was that we did not invest enough in donor relations. There was quite a bit of attrition from donors who gave at some point during the campaign. So in retrospect, it's one of those things that hindsight is 20/20. Looking back, that was an area that they did not put an emphasis. When I asked why they didn't put an emphasis, because it seems like almost an obvious thing that you would want to do, a lot of the priorities that they had and their ways of measuring success were around major and planned giving. So you can see the significant increase in major and planned giving during the campaign. That was the focus of their CEO. That was the focus of a lot of their major gift officers, was that they were being asked to report on those numbers specifically. It was a little harder to measure some of the post-campaign new donor measurements.
Thank you, Dan. Great work, and again, thank you to the organizations that spent so much time with Dan, allowing us to look behind the curtain, so to speak. It's really interesting, and I think the combination of the the qualitative and the quantitative here is quite powerful. Following the survey and Dan's interviews, we set our minds to trying to develop, based on what we had heard from these participants, what we think a series of best practices could be for organizations that are planning or moving through a campaign that would allow them to experience the same kinds of results that 10 out of the 11 organizations in this survey experienced, which again was, no effect, so the do no harm principle, or a positive effect that the campaign can have on annual giving. So we set about identifying and organizing a series of best practices that directly capture and reflect what these organizations actually did before, during, and after their campaigns to set themselves up for not only campaign success, but for ongoing fundraising success. So the first area that we are highlighting for you is really around the importance of campaign preparation. And not surprisingly, I mean, you heard from Dan that the small environmental organization that we spoke with had a 1/2 FTE devoted to fundraising. And they also knew that they needed to staff up in order to capture some of the so-called low-hanging fruit in their donor family to really get the campaign off on a strong foot. And it was, building up their capacity and increasing their staffing levels that really allowed them to grow and to accomplish their success. The campaign was so big and so much bigger than what they had raised in the past that they were forced to and willingly took a look at their database systems and their information management systems to ensure that they had the right infrastructure and elements in place to support volunteers, to track all of the action items, and to do the blocking and tackling work that is so critical to a successful campaign effort. And they also, many of these organizations were very mindful at the outset of anticipating how their annual fund could be designed or redesigned to complement and leverage the campaign activity. So campaign preparation is absolutely essential, and there are probably another 10 bullet points that we could put on this slide. These are the ones that really rose to the surface for us in terms of what we heard directly from these organizations that they did in advance of getting started. Secondly, as the organizations moved into their quiet or early phase of fundraising, really focusing on the prospects that had the capacity to make the largest gift to the campaign, they were very mindful about the importance of meeting with prospects one-on-one and heightening their engagement with the organization. One organization, and this gets to this dual ask blended gift strategy we'll talk about in just a minute, but as a preview for that, we have a great story from one organization that the board, as they contemplated launching a campaign, actually passed a resolution in writing. I mean, they wrote it down and everybody signed it, that they were going to do everything in their power to ensure that the campaign would not have an adverse effect on their ongoing mission and their ongoing operations. And that act and the fact that they could share that with donors as they were meeting with them really set the stage for them to have some pretty deep and meaningful conversations with their supporters. And for example, a number of the organizations that participated in this project at different points during the campaign and with different donors asked for a blended gift or a dual ask, and always led with the importance of supporting the annual fund and asking or inviting for a special campaign gift above and beyond the donor's annual support. And this allowed them to, number one, sort of reinforce the importance of their ongoing mission, programs, and operations. It allowed them to reinforce and recognize the important role that, you know, these donors have had in getting the organization to this particular point, and how important it is to maintain and sustain that support moving forward as they consider, you know, even more significant investments in their mission, whether capital endowment or program expansion. So the dual ask or blended gift strategy is something that can be extremely beneficial, particularly as you're asking some of your nearest and dearest, whether it's board members or longtime leader major donors, to step in with you to get the campaign underway. And then finally, and this may seem obvious to some of you, but you'd be surprised for how many organizations and donors this is sort of new territory, is to really emphasize and educate donors about the power of pledging, which allows them to stretch their giving. So you can imagine a conversation with a donor or a prospect who is maybe able to give $10,000 a year to the campaign, and all of a sudden when they are presented with the opportunity to pledge $10,000 a year for 5 years, they you know, leap to becoming a $50,000 donor to the organization. And that just really changes the way the donor thinks about their relationship to the organization and allows them to really leverage and increase their support of the mission for the campaign period and beyond. In terms of the community phase, or the quote-unquote small gifts phase of the campaign, which usually comes toward the end of the campaign effort, we learned some really important things from the survey participants and through the interviews. First of all, don't think that just because you're asking for smaller gifts and potentially doing it through direct mail and social media channels, maybe events, that somehow the demands on staff are going to decrease. In fact, we have heard that it is just the opposite, that as the volume increases and you're reaching out to many, many more people, the demands on staff can increase, and some organizations even went as far as hiring yet another staff person or contract person for the final phase of the campaign to ensure that they could deliver on all of the community engagement strategies that they wanted to make possible. There's also, I think, we heard an opportunity and a necessity to ensure that you know, you are creating a buzz and making a splash, as one person said, with your campaign communications and events as you're nearing the finish line, that you're very thoughtful, even when you're soliciting smaller gifts, to lead with an annual fund first message, And we can see this in things as simple as the response devices for annual funding or campaign funding, where the annual ask is presented front and center, and then there's sort of an optional section for, you know, members and grassroots donors to make an additional contribution to the campaign. Again, always leading with the invitation to support the annual campaign. Fourth, we heard from folks that when you're soliciting smaller gifts and grassroots gifts, you know, these asks tend to be more transactional in nature, and if you can develop recognition opportunities, you know, think of the buy a brick or, you know, put your name on this wall opportunities to drive smaller campaign gifts. Those kinds of strategies can be very effective in motivating a member or a smaller annual fund donor to think about their relationship to the organization in a more impactful and significant way. And finally, we know not only from our own experience, but from the interviews that using a challenge or matching gift opportunity to engage first-time donors and step-up donors can be extremely effective. Many years ago, some of you may be old enough, as I am, to remember the gold standard Kresge Challenge opportunities that were afforded by the Kresge Foundation in Michigan. This was just standard operating procedure for many campaigns, that they would apply for a challenge grant and use it during the final phase of their campaign to finish their fundraising, to bring new donors into the organization, and to encourage current donors to increase their giving to the organization. That program is no longer funded by Kresge, but there are many, many other opportunities for organizations to structure challenge and matching gifts, and they just continue to be extremely effective. In the area of communications and marketing, you know, a good development program and a strong campaign cannot exist without strong communications and marketing, and they really need to be as symbiotic as possible. And we heard from our participants really 5 key points. One is that creating a bold vision is an exercise and a habit that a campaign can motivate, and it needs to become habituated in the organization and something that gets done and revisited on an annual basis. It's a galvanizing exercise, it's a clarifying exercise, and even if you're not in a campaign, being clear about your purpose and your reason for being and what you're trying to accomplish in the world is something that should be considered on at least an annual basis. That then can tie into creating an annual case for support. We spent a lot of time, and these organizations did, in the early days of their campaigns, trying to get their campaign story just right. And for many of them, it honestly is the first time that they've thought about developing a case for a consistent and compelling case for support for donors that really talks about community benefit and impact. And that same discipline can and should be brought to the annual campaign as well. Third, there are a whole bunch of opportunities to earn media, free media, and to capitalize on that as much as possible. To ensure, as Dan noted earlier, to ensure that you're paying as much attention to your first-time donors as you are to your recurring donors. We know, based on all of the research that's out there in the world, that if you can't touch a first-time donor within the first couple of months of them giving to you, the likelihood that they will go away is more than 50%. So the investments you're making in soliciting those gifts then need to translate into really good stewardship and communication strategies. And finally, people love to celebrate milestones. So looking for opportunities with construction projects and other fundraising benchmarks to draw attention to your progress and success is a strategy that many of these organizations use to bring donors together, to thank them for their support, and again, to convey that a community is coming together to make something really incredible happen. In the area of board engagement, this probably won't surprise you because we talk about this a lot in fundraising. So our participants I think just really reinforce the importance of using the board gift campaign, which is typically the first step in a campaign, to model best practices in major gift fundraising. These are the first folks that you should be talking to about that dual or blended gift, maybe even asking them to consider making a multi-year annual pledge to provide you with some stability and predictability during your campaign effort. And then, of course, asking for the special stretch campaign gifts to ensure that every board member has sort of their personal action plan for how each person can bring their unique network, time, and talents to the campaign effort. Not everyone is going to be the fundraiser, AKA sitting in meetings with the CEO asking for gifts, but there is a role that each board member can play, and it's important to map that out in advance. And then I think to acknowledge that, you know, our experiences, and this was validated by the survey respondents and the interviews, is that at the end of the day, there really always is a core group of people who are going to do most of the heavy lifting. It's important to identify who those people are going to be early on and to pay very close attention to them and treat them as true partners so that they feel invested, they feel recognized, rewarded, thanked, just like you would with a donor for the work that they're doing to move the campaign forward. And that means not just celebrating with them, but also bringing them into many of the complex and challenging conversations that you will have during a campaign as you hit a roadblock or a situation that, that requires some really careful thought and strategy. Finally, stewardship, not surprisingly, we're ending on this note. As Dan shared with you, the organizations that participated in this survey, almost all of them have continued to experience very positive results with their annual fundraising, and the reason why that's happened is pretty straightforward. They've stayed in touch with their donors, they've kept them informed and engaged, they've reported back to them on how their campaign investments are bearing fruit, both in terms of completions of projects, but then what, you know, a new building is making possible in terms of their mission and program and ability to serve more people. They were very bold about having the conversation about increasing annual support once pledges were paid in full. They were careful in their planning for their annual fund to account for campaign pledge payment schedules. So, you know, one of our clients that participated in the study had a very detailed spreadsheet that showed when pledges were going to be paid off and when it would be appropriate to have that next conversation with that donor about annual giving. And then finally, to ensure that you are capturing and holding on to the staffing investments and gains that you've made during the campaign, and essentially to sort of interview the development team as the campaign is wrapping up to determine, you know, what did we do well, what do we need to keep doing, what do we need to do as a team in terms of our structure and our capacity, and especially in the area of major gifts and donor communications, and to ensure that you're really, you know, getting the benefit of staff input and retaining as many of those people as possible who now have relationships with many, hopefully many new donors. So that's our, those are our suggestions to you based on what we learned from this survey and what we believe to be true, and happy to discuss those at any point. Excuse me?
One more slide.
On our final thoughts.
Yep.
I know. So on to our final thoughts. Dan, what does this all mean to you?
Well, as the person who was primarily working on the survey, we started with a hypothesis, and the evidence that we recorded either in personal conversations and what people reported back to us was that our hypothesis appears to be correct. Now, it's worth saying all of the organizations we talked to used counsel during their campaign. So they were given advice on best practices, they were giving a lot of tools along the way. So that is a factor worth noting. But everything we could tell was that annual fund does not cannibalize the or the campaign does not cannibalize the annual fund, and in many cases makes it better. And the other thing people reported on this number 2, people were very eager to share their successes and failures. And a lot of those things, because the failures, quote unquote failures, led them to understand more about their donors and about the organization. And so what they were building was not just financial goals. They were putting better systems in place. They were getting stronger volunteers, better communication. They had a number of non-financial goals that not all of them set that out in advance, but one of the things you could do is build that out so it's part of your campaign goals. So you have financial and non-financial goals that go along with success in the campaign.
You want me to take the last
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Well, as we've learned through this project, I think just a good reminder that no organization is too big for fundraising fundamentals. And, you know, I think all of us always have a lot to learn as we enter these periods of growth and transformation. And even the largest organizations that may be oriented toward really focusing on major and planned gifts are, you know, missing something if they're also not paying attention to the front of the pipeline and people that may be getting to know them for the first time through their campaign. And finally, there really is no substitute for excellent communication and stewardship before, during, and after the campaign. It's the #1 driver of donor retention. It's the #1 driver of donors who choose to increase or upgrade their gifts. And it is the #1 driver for why people connect with an organization in the first place and stay involved to the degree that they may even consider making the organization a part of their legacy or estate plans as they move toward the end of their lives and their giving. So those are some of the big takeaways for us, and we really appreciate you sticking with us as we shared a lot of information with you. And if we have questions, we would love to attempt to answer them. We've got about 7-8 minutes left in our time together today. So Sarah, back to you.
All right, great. We do have a few questions. One is regarding the best practices slide about campaign preparation. In terms of increasing staffing levels, are there any additional or deeper recommendations around that and in campaign preparation more specifically?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. I would say that, you know, what we heard from people and what we have seen ourselves is that there are really 3 areas in which organizations look to increase their staff capacity during a campaign. The first is if they don't have strong database support in place, they look to hiring a database manager who can ensure that the database is ready to support the campaign effort in terms of developing reports and other tools to help people track campaign activity and also to process an increased volume of gifts. Second is that they look to hire someone who can help to manage the campaign effort itself. So a campaign manager or a campaign director who is, you know, the day-to-day coach, choreographer for the campaign effort, working directly with the CEO, the development director, and the board and campaign committee. And the third area where we see staffing investments is really in the area of donor relations, whether you call it major gifts or otherwise. You simply can't move through a campaign effort without having people who are prepared to engage in person and in small groups with your current and prospective donors. So adding people and the additions are usually in relation to how many prospects you have to work with. So adding another 1 or 2 or 3 positions to ensure that all of the prospects that you want to engage with hear from you is another really important area of investment.
And I'll just add to that quickly from a timing perspective. All 11 organizations we talked to added development staff throughout the course of the campaign. Not all of them did it at the beginning.
Right.
But we heard over and over and over, they wish, the ones who didn't, we wish we would have staffed up sooner. Mm-hmm. Because it just puts them in a better position to capitalize from an event standpoint, getting the communications all ironed out so that when you get into the later part of the campaign, you're not missing some of those opportunities.
Okay, excellent. We have a question from the audience, and I'm going to unmute Larry. Larry, are you there?
I am.
All right, Larry, go ahead with your question.
I just had a question about the capacity to handle both an annual and a capital campaign. I think our issue, we did see a decrease. We're right at the tail end, and I think it was because we only had one development person part-time, and we did hire a consultant, but he asked a lot of that person. So we did see a decrease because the major gift, the donors who usually give major gifts weren't approached. That's obvious. But we were concerned about the decrease, and we did see it hit our annual giving. So I think it has to do with what you talked about earlier about having the amount of capacity to handle both.
Yeah, I'll say too, from the data perspective, we asked people the question, since your campaign ended, what has been the result? So some organizations, their campaign ended 4 years ago, some 6 months ago. For the ones that ended more recently within the last year, the numbers might have been a little differently. We didn't break it out like that, but there were people who were still paying off pledges or some of those things that they were giving us an average of how it recovered. So what you see in the first year after the campaign might not equate to what you see in later years after the campaign.
Yeah, and I'll add to Larry, thank you for the question. One of the things that I believe that one of our participants experienced was there was a point in their campaign where they knew they had many, many more prospective donors that they could approach, but they didn't have the staff capacity to do so. And very smartly, they put together an analysis to take to the board to say, listen, we have X million dollars left to raise. We have X hundred prospects. If we could invest in one more major gift officer, that would allow us to engage with another 100 prospects and help us to close the gap between where we are today and where we need to be, 12 to 18 months from now. And that kind of, quasi-scientific analysis that really showed the potential upside of investing in one more position received the board support. They hired the extra person and they delivered on that promise. So I think in some cases, if you're having trouble convincing the leaders in your organization that these investments are smart investments, just take it back to the math problem, which is we have X number of prospects that are, we believe would be interested in talking to us. We don't have enough people or hours in the day to get to them. If we had another person who could take on a portfolio of 100 donors, we believe we can raise X dollars. It can be a very compelling case to make for investment.
Not only that, but the way we asked, I think, have you ever seen this technique where the pledge letter goes out and it says, would you consider a 5-year gift to the campaign? And then at the bottom of the letter, it says, also, would you consider a 3-year gift to the annual?
Yes, we have seen that, and I think donors can get confused by that. I think if you're going to do a dual ask strategy, particularly for smaller gifts, even doing things like mixing pledge periods, et cetera, can be confusing for folks. And at the end of the day, what I have heard your donors say is, I have so many dollars to give to you. Where is the most important place for me to invest? And as an organization, we have to have the courage to say, whatever the answer is for you, 99% of the time it's, we really need your continued investment in our ongoing mission and programs. So thank you for continuing to invest there. If you could do more and make a special gift to the campaign, we would welcome that. But for smaller gifts in particular, it's super important to lead with the annual fund, in our humble opinion. Thank you, Larry.
All right. Thanks, Larry. Okay, we have another question. This is from Jonathan, and he's asking, do you recommend incorporating explicit annual giving goals into stated campaign priorities?
Can I answer that?
Yeah, well, so Kate touched on the story earlier, of the organization that had a board resolution it was just to do the campaign. It was a printed one-page document that when the board looked at it, they said, you know what, we really feel it's important to have the annual campaign represented. And they hand wrote their names along with, this campaign will not hurt our annual fund, like one sentence. And that's the document that got brought around to donors, that donors absolutely loved, that there was this passionate commitment to keeping the organization strong through the campaign. So absolutely, I think if you can make it an explicit goal and get buy-in, again, with this culture of philanthropy, you want everyone on board, but that's something that we've seen work very positively with organizations.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And one additional comment to that is, and I'm sure you all see this in your work and in the field, the standalone capital campaign is now really the exception rather than the rule, and many, many more organizations are designing campaigns to be comprehensive, both of annual support and sometimes other initiatives, whether they're capital or endowment. So I think being explicit at the outset of what the pros and cons are of incorporating annual giving goals into your campaign vision is a really important conversation to have. And, you know, from a donor's perspective, it can be, you know, very illuminating for them to hear sort of, you know, where you're heading as an organization, how they can help, and how their increased annual and other support can really help you get there. So considering a more comprehensive and inclusive approach to your campaign priorities, I think is an important conversation to have.
Great. Let's ask one more question. It is, you know, 2 minutes after the hour, so I want to be cognizant of everybody's time. And we promised to get back to you on the questions that we were not able to get to. But a question that came in: what about board members that don't buy into the capital campaign from the outset?
Well, I think that's a subject for a different webinar. I'm just laughing, not please. So a great question, and boy, I mean, I feel for you and anyone who's experiencing that. To me, that speaks to a much more basic issue of how the board is being developed and how they've been engaged and consulted with during the campaign preparation process. And quite frankly, you know, there are moments in the life of every organization where sometimes a tough conversation has to happen with a board member that goes something like, you know, we are heading on a path, and it's clear to us that you have questions about this path. How can we answer your questions to your satisfaction? And if you can't answer them, the tough conversation is do you want to stay on the board as we move down this path? So I think, you know, number one, try to avoid that by ensuring that every board member has a role in helping to define the campaign vision. And if there is an outlier at the end of the day who is not coming along on the journey with you, it may be a moment when they want to reconsider their board service and step away from the board.
And I'll just add very, very quickly that we did ask that question to everyone who filled out the survey on the data. How engaged was your board before the campaign, during the campaign, and after the campaign? So just so you know, I'm just reporting what people told us. There was not a deciding factor. So if your board was not engaged prior to the campaign, it did not mean you were going to have worse results necessarily at the final outcome. In fact, oftentimes the campaign is what got the board more engaged. Mm-hmm. You saw several organizations report that during the course of the campaign, the board got more excited and more involved, and then after the campaign, they stayed involved. Mm-hmm. So sometimes it's the leverage, it's the lever that gets them more invested in the organization.
Great point. Thank you, Dan. And thanks for all your great questions.
Great. Well, that concludes today's webinar. Thank you to Kate and Dan and to everyone tuning in. Be sure to check out our website at campbellcompany.com for future webinars. And for those of you that we were not able to answer your questions, we'll make sure to get back to you over email. So stay tuned to hear from us. Thanks so much and enjoy your summer, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.